This is Unit 11, International Disaster Planning Part 1. This is your instructor, Dr. John Rennie. The unit objectives for this week is to describe how individual countries are responding to and collaborating with each other regarding the global issue of climate change, and to describe how planners can improve community resilience in light of climate change. In order not to get behind in this class, you should have completed all of the requirements for units 1 through 10. This week you have two readings. One is Climate Change, Flood, Risk, and Spatial Planning by Primus and Retfield from 2009. And the second reading is by Coetzee and Retfield from 2012, Adaptation to Climate Change in the Transport Sector. You have to complete quiz number 3 this week, and please contribute to the forum, which is using an example from outside the United States. Describe how planners are working to promote community resilience from disasters resulting from climate change. So, climate change. Climate change is an important and large topic that has become very politicized in past years. And we're going to talk a little bit about climate change, and we are going to take a look at some of the scientific evidence for climate change, and some of the physical evidence of climate change. And we're going to look at some of the international cooperation that is currently taking place to promote a response to climate change and to prepare and plan for the mitigation of the factors that result in climate change. And of course, why are we talking about climate change? Because climate change is linked with extreme weather. It's linked with increasing natural disasters from flooding, hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, and a whole host of other related factors. So here we see a map of the world, and we could see the increase in temperatures shown here. The darker the color, the hotter the temperatures. And you can see, of course, as you get closer to the equator, the temperatures get warmer, but the temperatures are getting warmer as we get closer and closer to the poles with climate change as well. There has been a lot of political debate, particularly in the United States, around whether climate change is for real or not. And the scientific community, by and large, has confirmed that the denial of climate change is really about politics. So, why do I bring this up? Well, it's important because people come from different political backgrounds. Some people are conservative, some people are liberal, some people are moderate. And it's important in a university setting and in a professional setting when we're working for governments, agencies, or working in the private sector with government agencies, that we try to take as an objective view on these issues as possible. Of course, that's not always possible. Certain governors have banned the use of the word climate change or global warming. But really, when you look at the heart of the evidence, we are having increasing temperatures, we're having increasing sea level rise, and I think most people can agree that that is happening nowadays. There's still debate about whether humans are causing climate change, but the scientific community has by and large confirmed that increasing carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, which has been a result of the human intervention into the natural environment, has resulted in increased temperatures. If you go on to NASA's website, they have a really good set of charts that take you through all of the natural phenomenon, such as volcanic activity, such as just natural changes in the environment, and what they have been able to link to increasing global temperatures is related to the increasing levels of carbon dioxide in the environment, which has been directly a result of human society. Let's take a look at the recent International Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC's recommendations for needing to keep global warming at no more than 1.5 degrees. They say we have a very short window in order to do that, because if we go above 1.5 degrees, we will have significantly worse impacts down the road, which still could be avoided. They say that there will be significant impacts regardless. However, if we do something now, which is not easy, especially from a political standpoint, we can still avoid the more significant long-term devastating impacts in the future. Let's take a look at this video.
I think if we can achieve those targets, then we'll still have a Great Barrier Reef in 50 or 100 years, but there's certainly no time to lose.
The Australian Academy of Science.
This right here, if you go to this NASA website and you look at global climate change, you could see the warming trends here going all the way back to the 1880s to the current time. And you could see that whether you look at the estimates of the global temperature from NASA, from the Hadley Climate Research Unit, NOAA, or Japanese Meteorological Agency, they all confirm that the temperatures are increasing, and this is an upward trajectory. And if you don't necessarily believe the science, and you need to have visual evidence of climate change, there has been a pretty successful photographer worked on a project called the Extreme Ice Survey. His name's James Balog. He's received a lot of credit for his work. I want to show you a small clip from his documentary, Chasing Ice. I recommend that you watch the entire film, which is about an hour and 15 minutes or so. But let's see a section of this film here.
Photography for me has been, as much as anything, about a raising of awareness. Through that camera, we become vehicles to raise awareness outside my own experience. And in this case, we are the messengers.
He is a visionary, and his works are like sacred objects. I present James Balog.
Well, thank you so much. Can we dim the house lights a little bit more? That's it, better. Okay. What I'm here to do tonight is bring to you tangible visual evidence of the immediacy of climate change itself. Glaciers matter because they're the canary in the global coal mine. It's the place where you can see climate change happening. Without further ado, let me tell you what we've been seeing out there. This is a glacier called the Solheim Glacier. We're looking down on it. Now we turn on our time lapse. You can see the terminus retreating. You can see this river being formed. You can see it deflating. You go back a couple years in time. That's where it started. That's where it ended a few months ago. Now down onto the side of the glacier, looking across the terminus, this is what we see. Look at this. You'll see deflation happening here as the heat takes away the surface of the glacier and the surface drops. At the same time, a stream is undercutting it from a glacier that's melting faster up valley, washing this thing away. The vast majority of glaciers in the world are retreating. Glacier National Park, Montana will need a new name. We'll be calling it Glacier-less National Park by the middle of the century because all the glaciers will be gone. There's such a strange, bizarre fascination in seeing these things you don't normally get to see come alive. We're up at the Columbia Glacier in Alaska. This is a view of what's called the calving face. This is what one of our cameras saw over the course of a few months. The action at Columbia is in part due to local glacier dynamics and in part due to climate change. Here's another time-lapse shot of Columbia. And everybody says, well, don't they advance in the wintertime? No, it was retreating through the winter because it's an unhealthy glacier. We realized it was retreating so far, we had to turn the camera upstream to follow the retreat. Then we had to pivot it again. And then, when we went back this past August, it was so far out of frame, we had to turn the camera one more time so we could still see the glacier. So that's where we started 3 years ago, way out on the left. That's where we were a few months ago, last time we were into Colombia.
So, how do we address climate change? Back in 2015, the nations around the world met in Paris for what's called COP21. This was an international agreement on how to address climate change. And the United States signed that agreement, which helped to signal our participation and role in helping to be we are a major emitter of greenhouse gas emissions and helping to figure out ways to bring that under control to achieve that target of no more than 1.5 degrees of temperature rise across the world. But the Trump administration pulled out, and now we are back to square one. And so this is becoming increasingly an interesting times as we are getting bombarded with more and more severe weather, stronger hurricanes, larger wildfires out west. We are seeing increasing levels of flooding. And so let's take a look at one last video that suggests that we need to make radical changes very quickly in order to rein in climate change and global warming. This video is a little bit difficult to watch because if the implications of it are that we really have to radically change everything about the way we live, which, from my opinion, is probably not likely to happen. But nevertheless, it is a thought provoking piece that really encourages us to think about what we can do. My area of expertise outside of disasters and evacuation planning is just planning for transportation systems and land uses in general. And I teach a different class that looks at land use and transportation planning. And when you look at places like South Florida, we've already kind of baked in our long term unsustainable transportation patterns for many, many decades to come based on the way in which we use our land uses. And that's very true for most of the United States and for many other places around the world. And transportation is such a large emitter of greenhouse gas emissions, whether you look at the manufacturing of cars, the fact that we live mostly in single family houses and consume a lot of greenhouse gas emissions, or that we drive around in single occupant cars, that changing that will not happen overnight. And in my opinion, it will be very unlikely that we'll be able to make any significant changes in the next decade, maybe in 2 or 3 decades. But so anyway, knowing that, it makes this really difficult to watch, looking at the recent IPCC recommendations. But nevertheless, we can't just give up. We have to take a look at all of this and figure out how we could put our best foot forward and work towards trying to make the world a more sustainable, livable place for future generations. So let's take a look now.
For the last few decades, the threat of human-caused climate change has been heavily studied and reported. The scientific consensus is now clear, and we've seen a shift away from why is this happening to when will the worst happen, and finally now to how exactly will this happen. We know massive, potentially catastrophic changes are just around the corner, and the scientific community has shifted its attention from whether humans are exacerbating climate change to exactly what kinds of disasters to expect. In this episode, we're going to take a look at the recent IPCC climate report and break down what changes we can expect to see in the near future and beyond. Before we go any further, we need to establish a baseline for understanding. There will be climate change deniers in the comments. There always are. But these people are a very vocal minority. There is no longer any doubt that human activity has drastically affected the rate of climate change, and we have mountains of peer-reviewed evidence to prove it. If you're one of the people who believes climate change is a hoax, just consider who would benefit from you believing that lie. Fossil fuel advocates, special interest groups, and members of the current US and foreign governments who are heavily dependent on the fossil fuel industry for donations. They are selling your future and your children's future for a quick buck. Look at the evidence, do your research. This shouldn't be controversial. Every single person on Earth, regardless of political leaning or beliefs, would benefit from the actions recommended by the IPCC report. With that out of the way, let's look at the report in question. First of all, what is the IPCC? The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Founded in 1988, the IPCC is an intergovernmental body of the United Nations, tasked with providing the world with an objective, scientific view of climate change and its various impacts. One thing to understand about the IPCC is that it doesn't conduct climate studies itself. Rather, it assesses published works from thousands of individuals and groups worldwide. These thousands of scientists contribute to the body of data on a voluntary basis, meaning none of them receive payments from any outside special interest group. When the IPCC is ready to issue a report, which includes a summary for global policymakers, the document is subjected to a line-by-line approval by delegates from each participating government, usually including the governments of more than 120 countries. The IPCC is the internationally accepted authority on climate change, and its reports have the agreement of leading climate scientists and each participating government. So, in short, when the IPCC issues a report, the world knows it's the real deal. That brings us to the 2018 report. You can find a link to the full document in the description below. Its full title is really long, so for the sake of brevity, we'll refer to it as SR15 or the report. The document itself is massive. The technical summary alone is 25 pages long. The entire thing cites 6,000 scientific reports. The summary for policymakers is much more palatable, at just over 30 pages long. In it, we get what's essentially a SparkNotes version of perhaps the direst warning the world has ever received. In short, we have 12 years to drastically change the course of our future. We've already passed the point of no return to keep global temperatures below around 1 degree Celsius warmer than pre-industrial levels. The race now is to keep it from exceeding 1.5. Even half a degree's difference could make for catastrophic changes around the world. This is the part where people usually get confused. What difference does 1.5 degrees make? I get it. I live in Texas, where it can be 40 degrees in the morning and 85 by noon. But consider places where the temperature is more or less stable. Take the Arctic, or Greenland, for example. Greenland is covered by a massive ice sheet that's kilometers thick in some places. In the summer, much of this ice is just barely staying frozen, and some places have even started melting. Now crank up the temperature a couple degrees Celsius. If that's enough to start a runaway melt, and the entire ice sheet melted, the sea level, on average, would rise by 7 meters. Imagine your favorite beach, underwater, coastal property destroyed, entire islands and huge amounts of coastline submerged, and the millions of inhabitants forced to move elsewhere. You think your country has an immigrant problem now? Just wait until entire island nations are destroyed by the rising seas. And don't think the United States is exempt from these effects. Florida is particularly susceptible to even a small increase in sea level. Besides a third of the state potentially going under, all of its barrier islands would be well below sea level, and with them goes any protection from hurricanes. An already hard-hit state would become ground zero of increasingly powerful hurricanes. But this is all speculation, right? No one knows for sure just how many Floridians will be going for a dip in the near future. Well, SR15 has some hard numbers for us. The disparity in negative impacts between 1.5 degrees of warming and 2 degrees is truly shocking. At 1.5 degrees, 6% of insects, 8% of plants, and 4% of vertebrates will lose over half of their natural geographic range. At 2 degrees, those numbers increase to 18% of insects, 16% of plants, and 8% of vertebrates. 1.5 degrees is projected to destroy 90% of what remains of the world's coral reefs. 2 degrees is expected to wipe them out entirely, completely destroying one of the ocean's richest ecosystems. At 1.5 degrees of warming, we can expect to see a completely ice-free Arctic summer once every century. At 2 degrees, once every decade. Global annual catch rate for marine fisheries will drop by 1.5 million tons at 1.5 degrees, and by 3 million tons at 2 degrees. These figures go on, and each one could potentially trigger an avalanche of other negative effects, and we haven't even looked at the consequences for human life. It shouldn't be a surprise that the populations that will suffer the most will be the poorer and less developed countries, and those in fragile ecosystems, such as in agricultural or coastal areas. If we could limit the maximum global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius, it would drastically reduce the number of people thrust into poverty and heightened risk of climatic events by up to several hundred million by 2050. The fallout of an increase of 2 degrees for humanity sounds truly biblical. A massive increase in vector borne illnesses like malaria, along with an expansion of their geographical range, ozone depletion, a drastic increase in heat related mortality, huge reductions in crop yields, including maize, rice, wheat, and other cereal crops, as well as a reduction in nutritional quality, drought and famine, flooding and extreme weather, and a stagnation of economic growth, to name a few. This is all very scary stuff, and it should be. We've managed to ignore the science for decades, and now it's time to pay the price. Thankfully, humans are very good at adapting and solving problems, especially if they're problems we created ourselves. We will have to deal with the long-term effects of the temperature increase we've already locked in, but we can and should do something to mitigate any further risk. The report lists a number of adaptation options for the regions who should expect serious challenges the soonest, including coastal defenses, sustainable aquaculture, and ecosystem restoration. But the truth of the matter is that we're largely at the mercy of world governments. Sure, we can stop eating meat, drive electric cars, and use less water at home, but even if every single individual did their part, it's still only a tiny step in the right direction. Just 100 companies are responsible for 71% of the entire world's carbon emissions, and just 25 of those 100 are responsible for half. As long as those companies are allowed to keep doing what they're doing, we're screwed. End of story. We could be optimistic and say, well, now that we have this report, world governments will obviously implement the necessary restrictions. Maybe in some countries, but if we've learned anything from the US in the last 2 years, it's that enough people in positions of power either don't believe in science or don't care about the future of their nation and the world that we've gone in the opposite direction. Legislation designed to protect the environment has been rolled back or repealed entirely, and individuals in the pocket of the fossil fuel industry are at the reins of the very groups that could enact positive change and stop this downward spiral. But say, by some miracle, the world comes to an agreement that we're going to meet the challenge to keep temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius. What would that require? In short, the single most monumental shift in energy, public policy, personal lifestyle, and consumption habits in history. We would need to transition to 100% renewable energy. Stop using fossil fuels for transportation. That means stopping production of traditional gasoline-powered cars, ships, trains, and airplanes. Stop cutting down trees and start planting them by the thousands. Stop factory farming and at least drastically reduce the world's meat intake, and hopefully transition entirely to lab-grown meats or other alternatives. If this sounds impossible and unlikely, well, that's because we've never done anything of this scale before. But it has to be done. Any of these steps on its own is a good thing, but it won't be enough. This is not something to be put off for another decade, or even another year. We, as citizens of the world, need to start putting real pressure on our governments now to get the ball rolling. If we don't speak up, they likely won't act against their corporate overlords. We all have to do our part by voting for candidates who support green energy goals and sustainability, and acknowledge the threat climate change poses to all of us. We have to educate friends and family who might not understand what's at stake. If we all work hard and do the right thing, we can make the world a safe place for future generations.
So that is the end of the Unit 11 lecture. It can be a little depressing, perhaps, but it's more important, I think, to focus on what could be done and how we can change. We can't get overwhelmed. Sure, the data shows that we have a very short window in order to avoid a terrible, potentially catastrophic future, but we just, we need to focus on staying positive. We need to work with communities to get them more prepared for disaster planning because we do know that more disasters will be coming. And we do need to figure out how we can use our votes, our knowledge, our careers to make a positive difference. We need to figure out how to make our communities more resilient. And the starting point is to become more prepared. So, again, end of the Unit 11 lecture. Thank you. And the next unit will be Unit 12, International Disaster Planning Part 2.